Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. This is also another one in my series of articles that I call the Communio interviews, since I am interviewing authors and theologians that are highlighted in Communio International Catholic Review, largely the North American English edition, of which I am on the editorial board, and they have given me this task. It's about the only task that they've given me and trust me with is doing the podcasting. But anyway, I have a very special guest today. I always say that, but this time I have a kind of ecclesiastical rock star on hand today, and that is His Excellency Bishop Erik Varden of Trondheim, Norway. Welcome to the show, Your Excellency.
Thank you for having me.
I have to say, when I jokingly say you're a rock star, I don't know if you know this, but in the circles, the Catholic circles in which I move, you are a very popular author. And when I told my subscribers to my blog and my podcast that I was going to be interviewing you, I was flooded with emails saying this is something they were very much looking forward to. You are much loved here in the United States, Your Excellency, so I'm very happy to have you here today.
Well, I'm humbled and delighted.
Anyway, for those who don't know Bishop Varden, he is actually not just a bishop. He's a convert to the faith. If I understand, grew up in a kind of lukewarm Lutheran environment, if not a totally non-practicing Lutheran environment. I don't know. Converted to Catholicism, I believe, in around 1993. And then it became a Trappist monk, became even the abbot of a Trappist monastery before being tapped on the shoulder by Pope Francis to become Bishop of Trondheim, Norway. He has an interview that was in Communio, and so we're going to be talking about that. But before I get to, did I get the bare outlines of your biography correct?
You've done your homework exemplarily.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Uh, it's not really covered in the interview in Communio, but I did want to begin with your upbringing as a sort of backdrop here. Uh, from what I read, yeah, you grew up in a fairly lukewarm Lutheran environment, if not a non-practicing one. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yes, and would you say that that is sort of what characterizes most of Norway these days?
I would say that's what characterized Norway in those days.
Boy, that is a door that's wide open for all kinds of interpretations. But later in the interview here, according to my little crib notes, I am going to get to the issue of modern secularity and modern secularism and what it means. So we'll double back and talk about that. And it's the Scandinavian countries, Europe, North America. I think we're all pretty much going down the same path these days. But anyway, the interview with you in the latest issue of Communio, and for those who follow such things, it is in the spring 2025 edition of Communio International Catholic Review. And the theme of this issue is baptism. I'll hold it up for those who are watching. Baptism, Communio International Catholic Review, and so that is to a great extent the focus of the interview that you submitted to in here. And at the very beginning of the interview, of course, then the focus is on baptism. And one of the things that struck me was a great quote. I wrote it down. I said I'm going to have to use this. I'm going to have to borrow it with attribution someday, of course, where you referred to baptism as giving us an inward compass that it focuses on inward compass that baptism magnetizes. I think that is a brilliant metaphor for baptism, and you kind of lead off with that. So what do you mean by that when you say baptism is it gives us an inward compass that is magnetized?
Well, in some sense, I suppose you can say that the compass is inscribed on our being. If we take seriously, as I think we must, the biblical affirmation foundational to theology that human nature is created in the image of God for the purpose of resembling God. then there is a Godward tendency in our ontological structure. But if we stay with that image of the compass for a bit, the creation story in the book of Genesis is complemented by the story of the fall, which speaks of the loss of the resemblance and the confusion of man. And it's as if the introduction of sin into the world and into human experience is a demagnetization of the compass needle.
Yeah.
Or that is true north loses its absolute attraction. And the needle first starts trembling, and then it starts going like this, round and round and round and round, 360 degrees. And that's pretty much the state in which we find ourselves as fallen and confused and perplexed human beings. And what baptism does by immersing us into the grace brought and enabled by Christ's resurrection and the saving events of his passion and death is precisely to recharge and reestablish that connection so that we remember what we're made for. And we remember that not only intellectually, but existentially and ontologically. I mean, I do firmly believe that baptism, and I mean, it's not an original thing to say, the fathers would insist on this, that baptism confers um, an effective grace that begins the work of transforming perception, sensual perception and spiritual perception. And so baptism enables us to begin to remember where we actually want to go and where we're bound and where we should be heading.
Yes, absolutely. I misspoke somewhat when I said that you wrote that baptism is the inward compass. Actually, the inward compass is, as you said, we're made in the image and likeness of God. We have this religious sense. We have this thirst for God, and without that orientation to God, that religious sense gets demagnetized. I love that. I just love that metaphor. And it is baptism that, in a sense, then magnetizes that compass. That it's not covered directly in the interview, uh, but it's an issue that is often raised in theological circles. So I'll raise it with you, maybe throw you a little curveball. But obviously, well, you deal with a little bit in the article. Obviously, there is grace also outside of the sacraments.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of the end of Bernanos's great novel, The Diary of a Country Priest, where the Curé of Albuquerque is dying without the sacraments and says, "Does it matter? Tout est grâce. Tout est grâce." All is grace. All is grace. Mistranslated into English for decades as, grace is everywhere, but it's tout est grâce. Now, Bernanos did not mean by that therefore the sacraments are meaningless.
Mhm.
Obviously, he did not mean that. So what is then the relationship? Because you say in here in the interview, and I think this is true, we have to do a better job, perhaps, of identifying in the world out there where that non-sacramental movement of grace is. Obviously, whatever movement of grace is out there is flowing through the sacraments in some way, uh, but it's out there without the particularism of a sacrament, and it's real. The grace is real, and we have to do a good job of encountering that and drawing out of it. I guess what the fathers would call the logoi spermatikoi and all that sort of thing. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that. What then is what is the weight of the particularism of the sacraments? Why that particularism? And it's related to the particularism of Christ, obviously, as well.
Yes, and obviously the I think you're entirely right to insist on well, if we believe that God is an almighty and omnipresent and omniscient God, and if his desire really is that all men should be saved, which is a, a New Testament affirmation, then he will he has the supreme freedom to exercise his saving power at his good pleasure. Um, and we must be extremely careful never to circumscribe divine action, and simply make it fit our categories. But the wonderful thing about, well, first of all, about revealed truth, and then about the divinely disposed means of transmitting and communicating grace is that they are assured channels,
Yes.
um, and they are objectively accessible channels. And I since you've quoted a novel, may I quote one?
Yes, absolutely.
Um, there's a scene that I think of a lot actually in one of Sigrid Undset's novels. I mean, she's chiefly known for her two great medieval cycles, but she wrote many other things, and she wrote notably two novels, which sometimes referred to as her conversion novels, because they tell the story of a young man in Norway at the end of the 19th century who decides to become a Catholic. And there's a scene during which he's been out on a revel at a party with some other people. And the party comes to an end, and he feels empty and lost. And he walks past the very modest Catholic cathedral in Oslo and finds the door open and walks in, and the church is empty. And he sits down in a pew, and it's dark. And right up in the sanctuary, he can see the sanctuary light flickering. And he sits there and he just fixes this light. And then he says to himself, if that light speaks the truth, then everything is different. Then everything will need to be somehow rethought and is potentially transformed. And implicit is the statement, and I here paraphrase what Sigrid Undset would neither have said nor written, but the sort of intuition is there, and if it doesn't speak the truth, well, then to hell with it.
That's right.
Hmm?
That's right.
And
Exactly.
and and
Go
and,
ahead.
and that is what the sacraments represent. That the presence of the flickering flame that says, the presence of God is here, and it is offered to you freely. Come and eat. Come and be healed. Do you want to be healed?
Yes, yes. I love synchronicity, and I love that image of the flickering light. That is great. You do say later on in this interview, I'm skipping ahead because you raised the issue, uh, that you think that actually modern people are looking for that objectivity, whereas perhaps a previous generation, post-Enlightenment, would have seen the particularism of the sacraments, the particularism of Christian revelation, the particularism of salvation in Christ as this great stumbling block. Gotthold Lessing's great ditch. The contingent truths of history cannot be, the vehicles of the universal truths of reason, and so on and so forth. But if grace is everywhere without being any place in particular, then it's actually nowhere. And so, yeah, you talk about this in your interview where you talk about modern people are seeking that objectivity. It's not a stumbling block anymore.
No, on the contrary, I see that every day.
Yeah, I did too. And back when I was a real person still and teaching theology in the classroom, I saw that every day too. You think it's a stumbling block, and it quite frankly is not. And that's
And
actually,
and
go
and
ahead.
I think the palpable, indeed the tactile nature of the Christian of the Catholic sacraments are in fact an immense exercise, an immense attraction in a world which is so saturated in the virtual and increasingly also some to some extent, because I think there's something turning there, tired of the virtual, frightened of it, sometimes disgusted with it. And there's something about the nature of the touch of the oil and the bread and the wine and the water. It's something, one of the great privileges one has as a bishop is that of presiding at the Chrism Mass in Holy Week, when the oils are blessed, the oil of the infirm and of catechumens, and then sacred chrism, which we use for ordinations. And there is an extraordinary rite during which, at the end of Mass and as the culmination of this great celebration, the bishop is seated before the altar, and the urn with the chrism is given him, and he breathes into it 3 times. And it's a theatrical gesture, and it should be a theatrical gesture because that is how the church communicates by movements and ceremonies and actions that are significant, that mean something. But when you actually sit there and breathe into this oil, the symbolism of all of Scripture, really, from the very first verse of the Spirit hovering upon the waters, and of God breathing living Spirit into the nostrils of Adam formed from dust. Um, and
Yes, yes,
this, the fact that this particular human being, who has been instituted and consecrated for the purpose of performing this act, um, is the particular channel by which a universal grace is being imprinted on matter so that this matter can go on in God's name and through Christ's agency in the church to transform lives. Um, it is just extraordinary.
yeah, it really is. And you know, I'm a Balthasarian. I did all my scholarly work on Hans Urs von Balthasar, and this is and my focus on the theme in his theology of revelation of the centrality of beauty in our understanding of these matters, and that the fact that there might be lesser beauties than Christ, that Christ is the inbreaking of an absolute beauty, doesn't diminish the absoluteness of his beauty. In fact, the presence of beauty elsewhere and our experience of it only makes us capable of recognizing beauty when it breaks in. I'm reminded of the line from Goethe. I hope I'm getting the German correct. He says, "War nicht das Auge Sonnen hat, die Sonne könnte es nie erblicken." If the eye were not already sunlike it, then it would never be able to see the sun. And I think that's how I embed the objectivity of the sacraments in this concept of beauty. You don't talk about beauty a lot in the interview, but I was wondering if I don't know how familiar you are with Balthasar's theology and so on and so forth. The interviewer asks you a couple questions about that, but maybe you could maybe make a comment on that.
Yes, and I think that line from Goethe is extremely significant, and it's highly applicable to the sacrament of baptism. I like to stress the fact that in antiquity, in Greek antiquity, um, baptism is often referred to as photismos, as illumination, and precisely as an opening of the eyes, that I may see. That prayer of Bartimaeus, the supreme prayer of the baptizand,
Yeah,
requesting baptism and preparing himself for it. And precisely that ability to see ever more the gratuity and goodness of things, of creation, of, to use an expression that St. Bruno, the founder of the Charterhouse, employs in his letter to Raoul at the end of his life, to gradually to acquire the eye, um, capable of seeing beauty
Right.
and of recognizing, first perhaps by intuition, then by an illumined reason, and then if God so designs, perhaps even by a personal encounter, by an experience of communion, what the source of beauty is, um, so that one can recognize the significance of creation and celebrate its beauties as both being having an integrity in themselves, worthy of admiration, and at the same time being signposts pointing beyond themselves um, to their designer and maker.
Yes.
Um, so in that sense, I think the Balthasarian line is of immense significance, and I think it touches a lot of what is going on deeply in the current Christian revival, which we can see tentatively in so many
Yes.
places in the Western world, where people precisely are tired of disfigurement, and tired of ugliness, and tired of make-believe, and tired of illusion, and then are enabled to see that there is something out there. I had a conversation just a few hours ago, actually, with a priest who'd prepared a young man for reception of the sacraments. And at one point, this young man had said to him, have you ever noticed how blue the sky is? Um, and the initiation into the Christian mysteries had equipped him with the confidence to actually start looking around, to heed that counsel of one of the Desert Fathers who said, "Look up, not down." Um, and he'd realized that there is a splendid whole surrounding me and carrying me.
Yes.
Um, and I
You
think
go.
that is what the church's pedagogy and her mystagogy prepares, and what the reception of the sacraments then enable to a supreme degree.
It's
One
excellent.
hears that again and again. I mean, you meet it in literature, but I also, I hear it in conversations with people of, when someone has been baptized and suddenly finds that life looks different. Not just because, not just in rational abstract terms, because one approaches it with different values, but it feels different.
Yes. And I think, perhaps, and I'm not opposed to this, obviously, but perhaps one of the downsides, if not the only one, to infant baptism is that it can lead us into this false sense that, well, baptism doesn't really change very much. Obviously, a little water goes on the baby's head, and okay, they're changed ontologically, but he's still a baby, and so you can't really, there's no difference that you can tell. But when you're baptized as an adult, then it's altogether different. Now, like I said, I'm not opposed to infant baptism, but adult baptism, I have run into many people that I was like their confirmation sponsor or their baptismal sponsor as adults, and I agree with you, Your Excellency. I mean, this is a real phenomenon where new eyes are given. Baptism actually effects something within us that's
Mm,
palpable and it's real.
mm. And but you're right, and in some ways, but I too am an advocate of infant baptism, just so
Yes,
that
yeah.
is
So
clear.
we've got that on the record.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. But in some way, but even as when you started the liturgy of the Eucharist, um, the the norm which shows the Eucharistic liturgy in all its coherence and splendor is a pontifical celebration in which the bishop, endowed with the fullness of the sacrament of priesthood, displays its completeness. And then we see that reflected in more pared down celebration, but it's only by keeping in mind the fullness of the norm that you will understand the allusions and the signs in more minor celebrations. And at the same, I think in the same way, you can say that the norm for baptism is that of an adult who turns to the faith and is step by step initiated into it. And we have a much underused resource, I think, in the rite of initiation of adults that takes you through the initial exorcism and the call and the questioning, and then, the successive scrutinies and the traditiones, the handing on of the creed and of the Our Father, which the candidate then gives back. And those are elements that I think it's essential to integrate into our adult catechesis as well. I mean, ideally, it should form part of preparation for confirmation.
Yes.
And but I think, I mean, we have a resource there, a catechetical resource and a mystagogical resource that we simply don't use enough.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get to the question of mystagogy here very quickly, but before we do, obviously baptism is meant to be then to change our lives, and we're to live it out, to put on the mind of Christ, and so on. That requires a deep understanding of a simple question. I mean, what does it mean to be a human being? A Christian anthropology. So, in the interview, you talk about, and I'm going to hold up a book that I highly recommend to people that I think it's my favorite book of yours, Chastity, Reconciliation of the Senses. A lot of my friends have this and have read it. Uh, but there's a great chapter in here called "What a Human Being Is," and the interviewer asks you about especially the Syriac narrative, the Cave of Treasures.
Mhm.
I had never personally heard of the Cave of Treasures before. And I've been studying theology since I was an embryo, it seems like. And I pride myself perhaps too much on knowing a lot of theology. And yet I had never heard of the Cave of Treasures. And I felt shamed when I was rereading that section in Chastity on this. So I think our viewers would be very much interested in hearing you sort of now exposit what is the Cave of Treasures? What does it tell us about the patristic theology of Adam, fall, mercy, redemption, and so on?
Well, I can only say that I shared your ignorance until I had the great good fortune of spending a few years studying and researching at the Oriental Institute in Rome. And I picked up a reference to that treatise in a book I was reading, and then I ordered it and I read it, and I was simply bowled over by it and by the perspective it enunciates. And then the more I engaged with it, the more I realized just how essential it has been in the formulation of Christian doctrine, both in the Syriac and in the Greek traditions.
Was it
It
a
is
fourth century document?
well, it's a document of uncertain origin, and one of the reasons it is so interesting is that it is a Judeo-Christian
Midrash.
composition. It would have begun life as a Jewish midrash, so a paraphrastic commentary on the book of Genesis, and then it would have been adopted by Christian circles, and then increasingly articulated in Christian terms. So it is a work without a single discrete author. It is truly an ecclesiastical composition. It's like a Gregorian antiphon that doesn't have a composer's signature, but which is really the work of the church. So the Cave of Treasures is a biography of Adam, and it tells the story of Adam from his creation to his natural death, um, and it tells the story of his physical remains and of his raising when Christ descends into Hades and fetches him, as we read in that magnificent ancient homily for Easter Saturday that occurs in the breviary, again an anonymous composition, and that we can see in the iconographical motif of the harrowing of hell when Christ hauls Adam and Eve out of the netherworld. So the Cave of Treasure presupposes that image which Ephraim the Syrian in the 4th century developed and made a canonical image, also for Western Catholics. I like to insist on this point that Ephraim the Syrian is recognized as a doctor of the church in of in Latin Catholicism. So he's not just an
Right.
Oriental author that belongs to Oriental Christians, but the church tells us no, he's ours. Also in the particularism of our Western heritage. So he presupposes this image of Adam being at his creation robed in a garment of glory, the robe of glory. That is a metaphor um, enunciating the divine resemblance um, that corresponded to the call ontologically imprinted on his being in the image. Um, so what the Cave of Treasures helps us to do, and this is really, really helpful, is to reflect carefully on what the human being was in God's first creative intention. We, particularly in the West, I think, have a tendency when we reflect on the protoplasts, on our first parents, Adam and Eve, um, to imagine them directly under the tree and eating the apple. Um, we can't conceive of Adam and Eve without the serpent.
Right.
Um, whereas the Byzantine and the Eastern tradition is much better at guarding the remembrance of man as he emerged from God's creative hand in splendor, um, embodying divine dignity and being resplendent with divine glory, being able to speak to God as a friend, as an equal, and without fear. So, this particular text is a great help in enabling us to take account of our origins and of the dignity in which and for which we were made. Another liturgical reference, that great Christmas homily of St. Leo that the breviary gives us for the Christmas vigil, when the Bishop of Rome tells his flock, Christian, remember your dignity. Um, that
Yeah.
is a dignity which is not which is infused by virtue of Christ's gift, but which is also part of our original heritage. So the Syriac tradition, and this text in particular, helps us to remember what it means to subsist in the image of God, what it means to be a human being set, firmly set, and confidently and freely and joyfully set on the track that actually leads to beatitude before the demagnification. Um,
Yeah.
and then it reflects on the tragedy of that loss. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I love that in the Cave of Treasures, but then you tease it out. The theme of being clothed, of being robed,
Hmm?
sort of runs throughout. So you've got the robe of glory that the prelapsarian Adam had, but then of course afterwards, oh, they saw their nakedness, and so fig leaf, then animal skins that God forges for them. But you point out that this was an act of mercy on God's part. There isn't any uh, sort of Jansenist condemnation of bodiliness going on here. Post fall, now our bodies are these repositories of just nothing but evil desires. There's something else going on in the theme of being clothed.
Absolutely. And I mean, our physical nature is part and parcel of our iconic nature, of our imagedness. Um, and what it is an extraordinarily touching image, often neglected in preaching, and often overlooked, I think, even by devout readers. That image which occurs towards the end of the third chapter of Genesis, when God is about to expel Adam and Eve in the name of justice from Eden, because they've by virtue of their treason, they've made themselves unequipped to live there. It's like, it's like Lewis's image towards the end of the Great Divorce, when you have this man standing on the threshold of beatitude, and he's faced with this world which is just too real for him.
Yeah.
Um,
A
so
great book, by the way, The Great Divorce. Great
It,
book.
it's extraordinary. So God is about to expel them, and the cherubim stand there with a revolving fiery sword. And then what does God do? He makes garments for them, garments of skin, which I mean, I speak of them in the book as a kind of an existential rescue kit in order to negotiate life east of Eden, where they have to conquer their livelihood, and they have to subsist within a nature which is no longer collaborating with them, but which is offering resistance. And these garments are there to keep them warm, to remind them palpably that God cares for them even there. And this is the image which is developed in a later Arabic version of the Syriac text, when God, sending Adam forth, says, Adam, you must go on account of justice. And I told you this beforehand, and justice is divine, but do not despair, Adam, and do not be excessively sad, because I have clothed you in my mercy.
Right.
Um, and that I think is an extraordinary image of and an exegesis really of the garments of skin. And the Cave of Treasures develops that train of thought further when it offers a definition of the church, which is, I think, it's my favorite summary of ecclesiology, when it speaks of the church of God as the mercy of God descending upon mankind.
Amen.
And if one keeps in mind that image of the warming, the comforting robe made to measure, they're not just off a lorry.
Right.
God makes one for each, and that is what the church brings, this this warming, sustaining sacrament of a presence that does not leave us orphans.
And when Adam leaves paradise, he goes to the cave and he worships God there.
Hmm?
It brings gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which of course then is repeated in the Gospels. But then, in a sense, the rest of Genesis is a detailing of, and the Cave of Treasures, how, how the descendants of Adam slowly moved away from that cave, moved out into
Yes,
the plains.
and the author, this too is very beautiful, um, poses the cave on the summit of a mountain. So the cave is where Adam is called to live and to worship, um, remembering paradise and having these souvenirs from paradise, the gold, the myrrh, and the frankincense, that remind him that this isn't just in his head. It's not something he's made up. They are sacramental realities. Um, but then, as if by some force of gravity, his descendants are pulled further and further and further down from the summit of the cave down into the lowlands, where they lose a sense of altitude, and they lose a sense of the height to which they may legitimately aspire by virtue of their nature. And they forget both their origin and their purpose. And then what is left to them is the search for distraction and pleasure.
Right, in circuses. And of course, there's the beautiful image then later in Christian iconography of Adam's bones removed from the cave and placed in the center of the world, which is Jerusalem. And,
Yes.
so you see in the iconography the skull of Adam underneath the cross of Christ.
Mhm. And then you have that through the grace of the Passion, when iconography will present blood and water trickling down the stem of the tree, um,
Yes,
the image corresponding to the tree of death, that wrought Adam's expulsion, and then trickling down into the earth, and touching the skull of Adam, even as God at the beginning took dust from the earth and formed him and made him into a living being. So now the bread and the water, the divine breath, flow down the stem of the tree and touch him again and revive him. And then you have this image of the embrace of Father and Son, um, which is and that relational terminology being used interchangeably. In a sense, Adam is
yeah.
Christ's father, and in the sense, Christ is Adam's father, and they rest in one another.
I am struck. We've only got maybe 10 minutes or so left. I am struck by the absence of Eve in being foregrounded in the narrative. Am I wrong about that?
No, well, I think what the narrator presupposes is their indwelling in one another,
Right.
being one flesh.
Yes.
Um, so that is not by way of discrimination, but I think it's almost like a narrative, a narrative technique in order to focus the intensity of the tale.
That is what I presumed as I was reading along, that Eve is included in all of this. I didn't take any sort of modern anachronistic anti-feminist diatribe going on here in the Cave of Treasures,
And
especially
I do think that's a legitimate assumption.
and I think so too. And then you do talk later on in the interview about the Marian dimension in our mystagogy. So let's kind of move on to that, and then I want to end with a brief discussion of modern secularity. So, what is this Marian dimension in our mystagogical, in the Benedictine concept of enlargement, the conversatio morum, the constant enlargement of our Christian living, the mystagogy of new eyes, of putting on the mind of Christ. What is the Marian dimension in that?
Well, obviously, the the goal and the finality of mystagogy is the realization of the mysterion, of the mystery in us, which is the formation of Christ in us, um, and his birth in us, and that is where um, the the account of incarnation ceases to be just an historical remembrance of an extraordinary intervention in human history some 2,000 years ago, and becomes an extremely actual and present reality. Um, and that is why the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, in a decision which was not uncontroversial, but which I think was a stroke of genius, concludes their great constitution on the church with a distilled account of Mariology,
Yes,
um, showing precisely how the Blessed Virgin Mary, as Christ's mother and our mother, is a guarantor of the continued realism of Christ's birth in the church.
very
That
good.
that is why also, of course, in the great basilicas of of ancient Christendom in the era of I mean, post the Council of Ephesus, say, we will sometimes find this great Theotokos um, in the apsis of churches. Um, Not because, I mean, it would be too reductive to say that, oh, they did that back then because they had such a strong Marian devotion. I think if you asked a fifth, sixth century Greek Christian if he or she had a Marian devotion, but they wouldn't have understood the question. But it was because that symbolic link of Mary and the church, of the Theotokos, and and the mystagogical assembly was so self-evident to them.
Yeah,
And because they were conscious of being themselves sons and daughters of the Father in Christ through Mary, and because they had that great sense of Eucharistic realism that confesses Christ truly present on the altar uh, in the Eucharistic mystery. That's another little trace of symbolism that I've come to understand in a new way through the immense grace of Episcopal liturgies. I talked earlier on about the blessing of the chrism. I also remember when I first had the immense privilege, because it really is an immense act of blessing a new church. And the power of the rite of the blessing of the altar, when first you anoint it, and you smear it with oil,
yeah.
and then and well, actually before that you embed the relics, so the living testimony, and then incense is burned, and then it is just such a moving rite, the dressing of the altar, this stone slab, which is then carefully and elegantly and beautifully dressed in white. And the church's way of interpreting the altar linen as both a sign of the shroud in which Christ, awaiting his resurrection, was was wrapped, and as being a symbol of the swaddling clothes in which he was wrapped as an infant. So the altar being both an image of the crib, um, both an image of nativity and of passion and resurrection.
Wow,
So, so,
that's
so even even the extremely sort of austere and in sort of in absolute principle term, the very masculine image of the altar is embedded with a maternal and a feminine and a Marian dimension.
that is so beautiful. And I agree with you. A stroke of genius on the part of Lumen Gentium, the Council Fathers, to place Mary within the context of the church. Had some had their way at the council, and Mary would have had her own standalone document of standard scholastic Mariology.
Hmm?
The problem that I have with that is that it does run the risk of making Mary into something rather extrinsic to our liturgical sacramental ecclesial life. You've got Christ, and then you've got Mary over here, and that's not to play into Protestant stereotypes that Catholics worship Mary. Not that, but there's a subtle extrinsicism there. Whereas Lumen Gentium placing Mary, embedding her within the church, creates a more intrinsic liturgical connection for us. It seems to me.
Absolutely.
Well, before we, I know you have to go here very quickly. I do want to mention that there's a great emphasis in your interview and in your book on chastity, on redemption as healing, and I want to mention that the orientation is towards theosis, it's towards the healing, it's towards the re-robing of our glory, and so that's a segue into the last thing I want to talk to you about, which is modern secularity. You talk a lot in here, and one of the about it, and one of the things that strike you use a line that I think is very critical, and I agree with it completely. You talk about modern people as being desireless and suffering from a desirelessness, which
Mhm.
then creates a kind of there's no telos to life, no finality, and all these kinds of things that then creates within us this questing, this thirsting for some kind of reintegration, some kind of healing.
Absolutely. I had an amusing experience 2 years ago when that book, Chastity, had been translated into Norwegian, and I launched it at an event organized by the publishers in Oslo at the House of Literature, which is an entirely secular venue. And I was there in conversation with a psychiatrist, a practicing psychiatrist, a woman. And it was very striking because there we were sitting on a stage in a house of literature talking about a book on chastity and heartily agreeing that what our times really and desperately need is a rekindling of desire.
Absolutely.
And I can think of nothing sadder really than the encounters one sometimes has with young people, um, 17, 18, 19, who somehow have the sense that they've done it all and seen it all and tried
Amen.
it all and and are disappointed and bored and um, and without any positive impetus or or any longing. And I think the really crucial thing there, almost, and I stress the almost, take what it takes is the the rekindling of even the vaguest sense of purpose and desirability and 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 the generation. I mean the 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 cranking of the inner motor that gets life back into motion, perhaps through some hidden grace, impelling them one day to look up and to notice that the sky is blue,
It's
or
actually
that
really
there are
blue.
stars in it at night.
To go back to The Great Divorce that you mentioned before by C.S. Lewis, if memory serves, and it's been a while since I read it, the only shade from hell that decides to enter to heaven is the one that's beset by disordered eros, which is
Mhm.
symbolized like a lizard on his shoulder or something. And the angel comes and says, "Well, let me kill it. I have to kill this thing." And so he finally relents. They kill it, but the lizard then transforms into, I think, of this white stallion that the man rides into heaven on this white stallion. It's sort of Lewis's meditates brilliant on this meditation on desire, on eros. And when it's disordered, it's awful. But the problem
Exactly.
isn't. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, 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 no. Once the man has permitted the lizard who is sitting on his shoulder, sucking his blood, permitting it to be detached, so that it is no longer the lizard sucking the man's blood, but this tremendous vital power, um, equipped finally to serve its intended purpose, which is to be the steed on which the human being can ride into happiness and freedom.
Absolutely, absolutely beautiful image in Lewis's book, and I loved it. I know you have a hard break here. You have many duties as a bishop, so I do thank you for taking the time to
Thank you.
come on.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I know that my viewers are going to greatly appreciate this interview. So, uh, best blessings to you, Your Excellency. Thank you for being on the show. And thanks to everybody for listening today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.